Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello, I'm Richard Reinsch, and today we're talking with Bill McClay about his new book, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. Bill McClay is the Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma and the director of the Center for the History of Liberty. His book, The Masterless, Self in Society and Modern America, was awarded the 1995 Merle Curti Award by the Organization of American Historians. He has written a number of other books, including Religion Returns to the Public Square, Faith and Policy in America, Figures in the Carpet, Finding the Human Person in the American Past, among others. He's a regular contributor to public journals on a wide range of issues dealing with American history and policy. He has been recipient of fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson International Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Academy of Education. Bill McClay, we're glad to have you back on Liberty Law Talk. When last we talked, we were discussing the shape of American patriotism. And so it's wonderful to have you on to discuss Land of Hope, which has been getting a lot of press, including in the Wall Street Journal, and is doing very well, I'm told. So glad to have you on.
Well, it's my pleasure. You left one thing off the list, is that I've been a contributor to Law and Liberty.
And you have been
not as often as I'd like. So I hope we can. I hope we can do more together.
We'll put the ball in your court on that, Bill. Well,
okay.
You fire away, and we'll take your material. We'd be glad to have it.
All right.
So, just reading your bio, you are a man who has written award-winning academic books. You've contributed at a very high level. You write this book, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading and preparing for this interview, but yet you write this book for America, for American citizens, to understand their country better, maybe to repair or to amend gaps in their education or the education they never received in the public schools, or even, sad to say, in higher education. And you work from the landing of Christopher Columbus all the way to the election of Donald Trump in this book, and thinking about the history of our country. So, Bill, maybe I'll ask you an easy question. Why did you write Land of Hope?
Not as easy as you might think, but there are a number. It's like anything, it has multiple causes. We historians always say this: everything has multiple causes. And this was perhaps overdetermined, but in retrospect, I guess I could say that. But I don't know. Look, for years, when I taught American history, I always, back when I was at Tulane, and then at the University of Tennessee, I always wanted to teach the American History Survey course, because I thought it was a course that introduced people to the subject, that brought them into the major, but also because I loved to recover a sense of the sweep of American history, of what the meaning of America is in a larger sense, which, almost anything you do of a scholarly character is going to be specialized. It's going to be focused. It's going to zero in on something. And it ventilated my thinking a lot to have to get up in front of a bunch of freshmen and sort of make the case. And so, that was one thing. I never found a textbook that I wanted to use. About 2000 or so, I wrote a little book for ISI Books called The Student's Guide to U.S. History, part of their wonderful Student Guide series, which, Harvey Mansfield on political philosophy and John Lucas on history, and, just a wonderful who's who of fine, conservatively oriented scholars. And I was asked to do the one on U.S. history, and so I did, and it was a lot of fun. It gave me a chance to sort of deal with these sort of blue sky issues. And but I did not, and I have a canon at the back of sort of essential books, for study of American history. The kind of, if there was a St. John's College of American history, the books that would be on the reading list. And But there's no textbook, and I have gotten grief about that, or pleasant, friendly grief from people for years since then. They write to me and say, "I love your little book, but why didn't what about a textbook?" And I have to write them back and say, "Well, there isn't one I can really recommend. I've got Paul Johnson's book is pretty good. It's not really quite a textbook, and there are a lot of things that deals with in enormous detail and other things that skips over and so on. But if I had to, I recommend that. The regular line textbooks published by the big textbook publishers, there wasn't any of them I could recommend, partly because of their ideological bias, but more than that, because they're so abominably badly written.
Mm-hmm.
So they're unappealing, and that planted the thought in my mind. Well, that we do need. There's a vacuum there. There's a book that nobody's produced, and actually, the closest anyone has come, in a way, is the infamous Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which is all the things the critics say. It's seditious. It's
Marxist,
even dishonest Marxist. And rather cartoonish.
Yes.
I
had to read it. I had to read it my freshman year.
Yeah. Oh my God. Well, the best critique of it has come from people like Eugene Genovese when he was clearly a man of the left, and Michael Kazin, who editor of Dissent magazine, still a man of the left, but an excellent and honest historian. And Michael Kazin's piece in Dissent a number of years ago on Howard Zinn, I think, is a definitive takedown of the book. But here's the thing: Zinn writes well. He has a good story. It's a little bit of a cartoon, in which sort of there's Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner are kind of going at it through American history, but it is readable. It is interesting, and so it's no wonder that the book has caught on to the degree of selling several million copies, and had the influence, and I think largely pernicious influence, that it's had. But nobody that I knew would step up, including myself. I didn't want to write a textbook, and people started talking to me about it maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
That's interesting.
I kept saying, "You're right. You're right. We need a textbook. I hope you find somebody to do it."
That's interesting, though.
I did not want to do it.
You say textbook.
I can talk about why.
It didn't read to me like a textbook, though.
No, that was one of the things I sort of stipulated at the outset when I signed up to do this with Encounter Books, which is not a textbook publisher. And I can't say enough good things about Encounter. I just want to say briefly that I've never done anything, even on a lesser scope, let alone this big, where I've had as much of a free hand as I had. They did, they occasionally, Roger Kimball wanted to see, how are you doing? How far you got along? He didn't want to inspect my chapters or have somebody else do so. There was utter freedom. And when the book was coming out, and I showed some proofs to people, they said, "Well, this is really good. Why did you publish this at an Encounter?" And I don't mean that the way it sounds, but they sort of, "Why didn't you go to Norton or someplace like that?" And I said, "Well, they wouldn't let me write this way. I know that. I've dealt with those people. I know that they are very nervous about textbook committees, about stakeholders, about the sort of various pressure groups representing identity politics factions that want to protect their turf within the books." And that's how we get the books that we have. They're not really written anymore. They're constructed with a view towards marketing and towards minimizing political flack. So you get what we get. And this, I was completely free. I was just one guy sitting up in his attic study, beavering away at night over the course of a year and a half or so, writing this thing. And I didn't have a research assistant. I didn't have anything like that. I did have friends who were willing to read drafts, and above all, my beloved wife Julie. So I didn't do it all alone, but I didn't have to deal with all of that. That my colleagues who write the big textbooks do have to negotiate all of that, and so it makes for an inferior product.
You were
no, go ahead.
You were in talking about the book that you've written, and you talk about having a free hand to write it, and so in a way, this sort of gets into, particularly as you comment on how textbooks are written or not written, or how they are constructed both for markets and for politics, but maybe not necessarily for historical truth or allowing an author to fully investigate the meaning of a question. I want to read a quote. You quote John Dos Passos at the beginning of the book, and I'm going to read part of that quote because I think it, and that's why you put it at the beginning of your book. Obviously, it really sets up what you're doing nicely. You quote him, John Dos Passos, quote, "Every generation rewrites the past. In easy times, history is more or less of an ornamental art. But in times of danger, we are driven to the written record by a pressing need to find answers to the riddles of today. We need to know what kind of firm ground other men, belonging to generations before us, have found to stand on. In spite of changing conditions of life, they were not very different from ourselves. Their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. They managed to meet situations as difficult as those we have to face, to meet them sometimes lightheartedly, and in some measure to make their hopes prevail. We need to know how they did it." And so in this book, you are trying to help us understand our country. We've talked about one source of misunderstanding, but there are a lot of sources of misunderstanding in thinking about American history, and in particular, this treasure that everyone wants to claim, the American founding. And how do you write about the American founding in this book?
Oh, well, I think let me take a sort of detour on the way to answering that. The one thing that struck me as you were reading that, and I had this quote in front of me the whole time I was working on this, and I came up with the title "Land of Hope," which I hope we can talk about a little bit. Also, before I'd written a word, I knew that I wanted that title. I knew I wanted to be guided in some way by Dos Passos's vision here. There's one phrase here that it's easy to pass right over that you read. He said about those before us, their thoughts were the grandfathers of our thoughts. I think that's such an interesting way. Dos Passos is a very careful writer. He doesn't say the fathers of our thoughts. He says the grandfathers. And I think in some way if you think about that kind of generation skipping aspect of one's relationship with one's grandfather. I unfortunately never knew my grandfather. They were both dead by the time I came on the scene. But I get it. I have a sense of it, of how different with grandmothers. There's a kind of effort of recovery, but also a clarity that and a kind of affinity that's affected by the filial bond and antagonism between sons and daughters and their parents. And I think that something of what that relationship of someone to their grandfather or grandmother is involved here, that we're reaching back, we're reaching around our immediate precedents to a deeper and more somewhat more remote, but also perhaps more fundamental relationship with our past and with what has made us what we are. And that brings me to the founding, because I think we one of the great things that's happened in my lifetime, is I think there's been a kind of rediscovery of the founding of the virtues of the Constitution after 100 years or more of the Constitution being disparaged by all the most advanced minds as being an 18th century document that has lived way beyond its time, and all the critiques so well and read about in Howard Zinn.
Yeah.
What's interesting is the Constitution, it seems to me, has come through and proven itself as having been had a much more advanced, much wiser view of human nature than the progressive, to oversimplify somewhat, but the progressive model that sought to supplant it with a kind of top-down, order run by experts at the top who, apply their disinterested knowledge in the administration of society, and we all kind of run around like John Dewey propelled Energizer bunnies in this wonderful, productive, harmonious order. And it just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work. That the Constitution's understanding of human nature and of our self-interested nature, and of the fact that, as Madison would say, faction is endemic to the human condition, and you can't eliminate the sources of it, but you can control the effects of it. That's what the Constitution is all about. And in a way, there's no better guide to governance here below than that. So I think I've been part of a generation of people who have reached back to the grandfathers, in a way, to an understanding of the founding of our country that we've actually, I think, traduced in a lot of ways. I don't think I'd have to persuade you about that, but that the possibility of returning to some extent to that original understanding is there for us. So that's one of the things I want to convey, the nobility of the founding, the astonishing precocious wisdom of these 40 and 30-year-olds, with the occasional Ben Franklin thrown in for diversity, to these very young men who were extremely well educated and had an ability to make use of what they knew. That's one of the things about Madison that especially is so remarkable. That they saw far, the errors that they made, and they did make errors. They weren't demigods. Were either careless errors, like the error that led to the mess up at the election of 1800, but they also issues like slavery that were very, very difficult. And always were, and always have been. And I try as much as I can through the whole book to put the reader in the position of statesmen who have to make choices, who do not have the luxury of waiting for an ideal solution to present itself, or the luxury of being a William Lloyd Garrison, whom I treat with respect, but who insists on absolute, immediate, now,
right.
without delay, eliminate the evil and despicable thing. So Lincoln, needless to say, Lincoln comes off very well in my account, partly because I don't try to prettify the ways in which he would not sort of pass muster in today's Democratic or Republican Party, but particularly not the Democratic Party, but that in the position of a statesman who has to operate within the limited options that circumstances present, he was extraordinarily good and extraordinarily far-sighted, compassionate when he could be, tight-fisted when he had to be, deceptive when he had to be. I think one of the things that has happened to the telling of history is that we're so inured to the notion that politicians are liars and deceivers and BS artists, all of which is true, of course, but they aren't only that. And politics can be a noble occupation. You know, there's this saying, politics is the art of possible, that is variously attributed. I guess people mainly give it to Tip O'Neill, who I can't believe really originated, but let's say Tip O'Neill did. And I think that the meaning that we genuinely attribute to that, right, is that, well, politics is a matter of doing the best you can with the messiness and circumstantiality of real life. Mm-hmm. I think, and of course that's true. That's exactly right. That's what Lincoln did that. But it's also the art of the possible in the sense of, you have the chance as a leader to create possibilities. You have a chance to change the way, even if it's a matter of just nudging the aircraft carrier a little bit, you have a chance to change the way that the public thinks. Yeah. And help them to recover, particularly things that they've forgotten. Yeah. And this is, I think, again, another aspect of Lincoln's genius. He talked about the mystic chords of memory. He wanted to awaken that national bond that was falling apart after the election of 1860. It was what had already been starting to fall apart. And he wanted to speak to that.
Thinking about...
go ahead.
I think one of the things in your answer is the purposes or the proper uses and the misuses of American history. And there's a really nice paragraph you have in your introduction. I just wanted to read part of it because I think it sets forward what history is about and how it's sort of inseparable, you argue, from who we are. You say, for the human animal, meaning is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Without it, we perish. Historical consciousness is to civilized society what memory is to individual identity. Without memory and without the stories by which our memories are carried forward, we cannot say who or what we are. Without them, our life and thought dissolve into a meaningless, unrelated rush of events. So thinking, just now, about the uses and misuses of American history. One thing you hear is we don't tell our stories well, or we don't tell them at all anymore, mm-hmm. or we have new generations coming online who are emerging into adulthood who know very little about major battles, major wars, major figures, major documents. But then thinking about this passage though, can we be that for long, or are we in the midst of, and I'm thinking about the New York Times, the 1619 Project that has just emerged, or are we now in the process of those with means and capability telling us new stories about who we are?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think that the whole attitude, at least of the historical profession, and then that seeps out in the culture more generally. For the whole time I've been in this business, has been deconstructive, if not in name. In fact, we are resistant to large narratives, grand narratives about much of anything, and it is frankly easier to make your mark in the field by being a revisionist, by sort of taking down some little piece of somebody else's narrative without necessarily supplying a substitute one of your own that is coherent, that can withstand that kind of examination. So we really in a way have no stories at all. And of course, what would be that is, I believe, a vacuum that cannot last. And I think the sort of wokerati that are so becoming such a dominant force, at least in campus life. I don't know how much in the rest of the culture, but certainly at the New York Times, it's just a triumph of that sort of view. They have a kind of story, which is mostly a story about how wrong the other story was. You can't really, part of the absurdity of what 1619 is trying to do is you can't really call this tiny little episode in 1619, which of course has enormous consequences, and I don't blink that at all, but a foundation or a basis for reframing all of American history. That's an absurd claim. It just simply can't be done. What you can do is to use it again and again to dispute other versions of the narrative that may have a greater degree of coherence to them. But they're not creating the basis for a story that's going to actually work as a story for us. It requires us to ignore too much and concentrate our efforts on too small a sort of starting place, which is not really a starting place. It's not foundational. The founding is a founding. We had a founding. One of the extraordinary things about our founding is it's something that took place sort of in the open. I don't mean that they didn't meet,
there's a trail of
secretly,
documents,
privately, but there's a trail of documents, exactly. And there are these non-demigod figures. We don't have to go back to Romulus and Remus to talk about our founding. It took place in the open air in that sense.
Talk about
not in a transaction, obscure transaction in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619.
Yeah, but you think as well. The New York Times publishes the 1619 Project, in effect defining America through slavery. This is the most important newspaper in America. Academics writing these essays. It seems to me one could only do that because so much of this, maybe I'll call it postmodern history, social history, cultural history, so much of that has been laid down now for decades that there is sort of this way of reordering people's thinking about the American founding. I'm curious what you might think of that, but also in general, how should we approach, because what I've noticed in progressive histories of the American founding as it relates to the Constitution and slavery, we have 3 clauses in the Constitution principally dealing with slavery. The Fugitive Slave Clause, the 3/5 Clause, and the non-importation, none of which, as you noted in the book, have the word slavery, which is a crucial move they make in the text. But it seems to me progressive historiography or progressive understanding of the Constitution is now so many more provisions of the Constitution are about enforcing slavery. Alan Finkelman comes to mind, as well as others. Sean Willents, the Princeton...
Paul Finkelman,
Paul Finkelman, right. I'm sorry. Sean Willents now has this new book taking this on, a progressive historian, but arguing against this move of a lot of his fellow academics. But it's out there, and no one has seemingly rebutted it.
Yeah, well, look, I think there's a kind of systemic ungenerosity in the scholarship of some of these people that is it's hard ultimately to answer, when there's not a disposition towards hearing the truth when it's spoken. I can't say it any more strongly than that. At a certain point you just give up, but there's something I want to say that we'll go back a little bit, but
okay.
You mentioned something about how all this stuff has been out there, and what's out there is it's not a detailed knowledge of the social history, but a sense, first of all, that there was an account in the past that's wrong. And I'll give you. I've been at this for 30 years. This teaching history, and when I started out. And, this is in the 80s, so it was not exactly, the era of Parson Weems and or George Bancroft or whatever. But still, the atmosphere was different. And I taught high school briefly, and what I'm going to say is even more true there. But you would give, and I always give essay questions in my tests, and there would, back when I began, there would invariably be, particularly in the weakest students, this sort of rendition of Stars and Stripes Forever, as I called it, where they wouldn't really know the answer to the question, but they would say, well, this was something, the reason the economy grew in the post-Civil War era is because America's the greatest nation in the world, and it was coming into its own, its destiny was, I said, yeah, but can you give me some data, some facts? But there was always this feeling that, well, I can always fall back on the sort of wonderfulness of America in a sort of mindless, really pretty stupid way, and a way that took me for being stupid. But it tells you something. Now, the same move, the same student transported into the present moment would, there was a lot of economic progress, but there was a genocide of Indians, and there was despoilation of the environment, and it was really a conquest rather than expansion. And so they know, they sort of quote unquote know these things. They don't know anything.
Yeah.
They don't know anything more than the lunkheads 30 years ago knew when they were singing Stars and Stripes Forever in their essay questions. But it's the change in the default. The default position of the ignorant is 180 degrees apart from what it was. That's what's changed. And you have to. And I add one other thing, that the general ignorance of young people, for which I don't blame them. They're not going to especially hear this and say, "Oh, gee, well, Professor McClay doesn't blame us." So that I'm sure people will hear this and say, "Be insulted," but it's true. Their general ignorance extends to an ignorance about affairs beyond our shores. So they have, and beyond our time period. So they have no notion. You tell them slavery has been a feature of nearly all human societies in human history. And it's only in the modern age that we have made a sort of moral break from the institution, and that this was a change that was happening in the time that the United States was being founded. Not coincidentally, that it participated in that moral ascent, that moral awakening, but imperfectly so. A lot of them don't know there was slavery in the ancient world. They don't notice the slavery in the Bible if they think about it, even if they ever read the Bible. They don't understand the degree to which forced labor of various kinds has been such a ubiquitous feature of human societies, and how different what we enjoy today is. They don't, and I always want to say, when they start being critical of America, compared to what? That ought to be our question. Compared to what? Compared. Well, I won't start going down the list, but
no, that was my question.
Some of them, Venezuela, for example, comes to mind. I have a number of friends at University of Oklahoma who are Venezuelans, and who are there because of the horrors of their own country. But they
and you can say much the same thing with capitalism and markets. How many students are aware of the incredible turnaround in human resources for living, and all sorts of indices of qualitative life improving, at the year 1800, principally in Northern Europe and the British Empire, and they have no clue of that either. That was my question. This summer, I taught two different groups of students, and we had a day on the American founding, and I asked the question, compared to what, several times, on women, and also how blacks were treated in the American founding. But I also, there's a question also with regard to the American founding, not only compared to what, I'm losing my train of thought here, but I'll leave it at that, compared to what, but also education in republics, that all republics, all those republics face this problem. And I wondered, have we been doing it poorly, or compared to what? Have we actually been doing it okay? We're just, as Bill McClay and Richard Wright are uptight conservatives, and we just always are looking for decline. I'll say that's true of me.
I can relax with you though.
Yeah, but is that there? Yeah.
Look, this is really a great and important point, and it's something that I think we need to address ourselves to, because we haven't been doing well. It's an intrinsically difficult task because we don't believe, our highest ideal of education is something we call liberal education, which is, educating people for liberty. And we should never renounce that, but that means we don't pound things into them. Learning to be a patriot is not like learning the multiplication tables or something, or memorizing the various forms of the Greek verb to be, and so on. It is something that has to take root in the affections as well as in the intellect. And I don't think we've thought enough about that. I sometimes have this discussion with people who think, well, what we need to do is teach the principles of the founding. And I'm all for that, but we also need to teach the history, the story in which they're embedded, and the story is our story. It's a story that we are part of, and it is part of us. And the working out of these principles in time. We also need to show people how to be citizens in a concrete way, which is one of the many reasons why federalism, the restoration of federalism and the preservation of the federalism to the extent that we still have it, is so important, because without local institutions, Tocqueville, of course, is one of the preeminent people on writing about this, but without local institutions which people can exercise republican citizenship, that's just a matter of voting, which is like a kind of consumerism. Politics is consumerism. You pick, this grand amount voice rather than that. But to be actively involved in self-rule, because that's what republicanism is ultimately, self-rule. Small r republicanism, of course. It is ruling yourself rather than being ruled. And one of the great challenges of the next 50 years is going to be to try to rein in the administrative state that's really depriving us of the capacity for self-rule, even under our constitutional system. But I think all of these things, knowing the principles, knowing the history, and also having, or at least seeing before you, opportunities to be citizens, to engage in that activity of self-rule. No substitute for those things. And I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but we do have to have the right things in mind. I'm part of, and I'm very proud to be part of, the Jack Miller Center for teaching America's founding principles and history. And I was one of the people who really wanted to see history included in the title of that organization, because the principles are just abstractions, absent the historical context in which they have arisen and in which they are exercised.
But now it's interesting, just adding further complications to that. How would people understand their citizenship now? And I asked that question because the idea of identity politics itself seems to make republicanism very difficult. Seems to make
it does, and so does So does the notion of global citizenship, which I think is one of those counter narratives that actually is oxymoronic. Yes. You stole my word.
It was interesting. We just reviewed a book on law and liberty called West Wingers, the dreamers inside the Obama White House. And this is a book written by millennial staffers in the Obama White House. Most of them, mid-level staffers. And
I saw that review.
And, as I didn't read the book, but going on the reviewer, every one of them had a job that related to some identity politics outreach. And I kind of thought about that as, okay, that now becomes the work of Republican citizenship in America. And you lose any sense, and history's bad. It's exclusionary. We're now trying to, correct that, amend that by bringing in all these other groups. I guess the problem is we never really get back to trying to become one or thinking about what actually makes us Americans apart from just these trying to assemble these identities into various electoral groups.
Yes. No, and that's going to be hard to, there's a book I haven't read yet by Mary Eberstadt in which you may have seen that was Quillette had a piece by her, and she's arguing that in fact the disintegration of the family has played a role in the rise of identity politics, and vice versa. There's been a mutual relationship, but that's an idea that actually was absolutely new to me. But the moment I grasped what she was saying, I thought, I must read this book. So I've ordered it, and I want to read it. But that's another thing that people grasp onto identity politics because they don't have either below them in the family or neighborhood in their place to which they belong, or above them in the notion of the nation state. They don't have, and these are people working for the national government in that book, but they're not really, their loyalty is not to the nation per se.
They can only be, they're loyal. Cartoon. It's like the country comes through the clientele group. Whatever that is. And it's whatever the country is treating that clientele group. Reading your book, and you profile crises, wars, the Civil War. I loved your chapters on the Civil War, the coming of the war, and then how it was waged, and then Reconstruction afterwards. How should we think about crises in American life? And are we in one now, as we're being constantly told?
Yeah, I think it is, to quote Arthur Schlesinger's first volume of his Age of Roosevelt trilogy, it's a crisis of the old order. The old order that doesn't think of itself as an old order, but it's really the post-World War II and especially post-Cold War kind of settlement and institutions and that premises that were taken for granted about the advantages of multilateral, multinational organizations and the death or dying or attenuation of the nation state, and all kinds of things like that are coming into question, and that those premises. So one of the elements of the present is this process of trying to recover, the national identity without, let us hope, without some of the negative aspects of nationalism, a word I hesitate to use because it's become kind of abased, but and without sacrificing many of the economic benefits that are very widely distributed that have come from lowering of national barriers. It's a delicate thing, but I think there are people out there who feel as if we're in a crisis. I don't know whether we are really. I think it's so threatening to the feed bags of people who are very well situated in our society, and that's where I have a little bit of Thomas Jefferson in me. They sort of a little revolution every now and then. It's a good thing for a Republican government that people get entrenched in. You look at I can't even begin to tell you how appalled I am that we what has emerged about the director of the FBI, and that he will not be punished for it, other than being subjected to the contempt that he already was getting from the right side of the ledger. But otherwise, well, this is really a deep corruption, and much more of a concern to me than Trump. As is the use of the FISA courts and all of this that is kind of being remarked upon only by a certain segment of the population and ignored by others.
Well,
I think.
I mean, and that's sort of, maybe this is the same question or a related question, but thinking about past episodes of rancor, of intense and heated disagreement. Thinking now about our present situation, it seems to me it's troubling, but it's not grave. And we've had situations like you document in your book, of much greater disagreement and trying to rule out or exclude people from public discourse. You also talk about Woodrow Wilson and World War I, and the ways in which he shaped propaganda as well. But it does seem at times, if you listen to conservatives, many of the ones we respect, and progressives, there really are just two different understandings, not only of the country, but of what it means to be a human person and what it means to flourish. And how those are reconciled is very difficult to see.
Yeah, it is. And, but I think we can also think ourselves into this crisis as being something that has to come to some sort of violent, eventuality. And I don't know that it does. I mean, I think some of, my view is a lot of the premises of the other view are simply untenable, and that they tend, just as when people grow up, they tend to start to try to start their lives.
As the millennials would say, adulting.
Yeah, adulting. Yes, right. that they come into contact with the real world, and they learn things that about the way the real world operates, which they wouldn't otherwise acquire. I mean, one thing that sort of, in my mind, screams out for me to mention here is the degradation of higher education that has occurred at the same time as it's become more and more universal. So that and easily captured by, look, I work in higher education. I love doing it. I love the overwhelming majority of my students. I mean, I love them. I don't just like them. I really, I feel the luckiest man in the world at times, particularly at the University of Oklahoma. But it's so easy for these organizations to be captured by a tiny number of people who, about whom I don't have many good things to say, except that they have zeal and they have guts. And the absence of leadership, I mean, that's the biggest problem. The president of Yale ought to be, he ought to be, somebody ought to write a biography of him and call him Symbol of an Age. Because we used to have Andrew Jackson, Symbol of an Age, famous book by John William Ward. We could have whatever his name is, that Symbol of an Age, because he really is allowing a great American institution to go down the tubes, and almost willfully. But they're his kind all over, and
but that really comes out of I think about your friend and colleague and my friend Ted McAllister. One time he said to me, "We don't remember well anymore." Yeah, and remembering well isn't something we're doing anymore. And I've thought about that phrase, remembering well, that has stuck with me. And I think remembering well, part of it is, as you discuss in Land of Hope, generosity and generosity towards the past, and a willingness to see through the difficulties, through the dashed hopes and disappointments, what also has been achieved. And that's somewhere along the way that's been lost when it's slavery in the founding, women in voting, Jim Crow, but yet Civil Rights Act and all of the enormous things have been achieved. Somewhere like that part of the equation doesn't get brought out in full. It's always downplayed.
Yeah. Well, and I think gratitude.
Yes.
It is so important, and it's important to a flourishing life. I mean, Christopher Lash wrote some things about Jonathan Edwards that made an enormous impression on me. That one of the dispositions of Edwards was a kind of gratitude to being itself, to the very fact, the deepest ontological thing, the very fact of being itself. And I think that's actually something we maybe have lost, partly because we live in a world where we're so knowledgeable about the efficient causes, the operating causes of things, that we think the world can be engineered.
But no final cause.
So there's no final cause. There's no grace. In the full theological sense of the term, there's no the unbought grace of life.
Yeah.
Edmund Burke's wonderful phrase, which it's really, really a phrase that I've thought about many times. It's so important. It's unbought. It's unengineered, because if it were engineered, it wouldn't be grace. But I think that actually is one of the things, the deep philosophical things, and it's very American because we're a can-do people. But this sense that of discontent with the world that we either have made or we know we should be able to make or remake. Instead, I think the most fundamental thing is a gratitude to the sources of your being, and that's your parents, however flawed they may be. They still are your parents. I'm hoping my kids have a similar disposition to me. That's kind of a very fundamental aspect of love and living in a society that remembers well. Is you remember your own sins too.
Yeah, that's right.
But and then to be grateful to the country, and in a way you need. You can learn that gratitude by going somewhere else and seeing, oh wow, it's not quite. I'm always amazed at what good it does for particularly minority students, particularly African American students, to go to study abroad anywhere, Europe, Africa, wherever, and come back and then they always say the same thing. I never realized how American I am, and how much everything I value about myself is tied up in my Americanness. So many things I value about myself. So, I think that gratitude for the sources of your being is part of remembering well. And it's remembering, dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. And we should, whatever our theology is, we should be grateful for the time that we're here together and do the best we can with it, and be grateful to the efforts of others, even if they're flawed individuals. Can I, in that connection, mention something that is actually almost nothing is being said about, and
Please.
It's sort of staring us in the face, and that is Martin Luther King. We had this revelation several months ago by I can't think of his name, the historian from Emory.
Yeah, a left-wing historian. Very much so. A very, and also a very fine biographer of King. Yeah.
About King, that we'd always known he had some dalliances and so on, and had not been faithful to his wife, but evidently it was much, much worse than that.
Yeah.
It was Kennedy level, maybe even Clinton level compulsiveness. Yeah. With violence, with at least one episode of alleged rape that he either was involved in or observed without, as an amusing. This is. It may some. There are two lessons to be drawn from this. One is that the FBI has been too powerful for a long time, and the left has been right about that. the second thing is, what are we to do with this knowledge? Are we just going to kind of do what the New York Times and others are doing now, which is sort of acting as if we didn't hear it? How are we, and not refusing to publish? The author of the book had to go to England to publish it in Standpoint, magazine. And I think this could be a great, if I may say, teachable moment. That here's a man who did really, evidently, did reprehensible things, and we knew some other things he did that were, plagiarizing his dissertation and so on, that were not so good either to begin with. But this can't really be explained away. But what you can say is, and this, we ought to extend this courtesy to others, but what you can say is this was a great man with great faults, and those great faults cannot be ignored, but they also do not erase the greatness of what he did, the enormous contribution he made to this country, and the courage he showed. He knew that what happened to him was eventually going to happen. It was bound to happen. That he every time he appeared in public, he knew that he was laying his life on the line, and he did what he did. I don't need to go on about the virtues of Martin Luther King, but you get what I'm saying, is that there's an enormous debt that the nation owes to this man. He was a great man, and yet do we completely erase him from history because he violated the sort of Me Too standards of the moment? Clearly we don't, but people don't know what to do. So that's why they're remaining entirely
I'm glad
silent.
you said that. I've had very similar thoughts on that as well, and the
so
level of silence. We don't know what to do with it exactly.
Well, I think I know what to do with it. It's not easy, but I think it's what we do with Thomas Jefferson. It's what we do with George Washington, for God's sake, at the school in San Francisco where they're covering up their mural. We acknowledge that we are flawed creatures, and that greatness comes in less than perfect packages. And let's grow up and be mature in looking at what the human condition really is. That's what history is about. One of the reasons I think my book has been somewhat successful is that I try to say in the book two things. One is that we do have a history full of flaws, full of shameful things. They are not the whole story, and it is a great story. And it is, particularly compared to what, a very great story. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. We shouldn't. The Howard Zinn version of history is just another myth. You can have the myth of America as a Christian nation founded in virtue. You can have the myth of the founders as demigods. You can have the Parson Weems myth about George Washington. All of that. That's, I think, a disservice, in addition to being not really true. But what Howard Zinn has done is an equal and opposite disservice. And actually, it's partly the fault of the profession that happened. I don't believe Zinn. I actually go easy on him in one way. I think that if there had been books like Land of Hope, to be part of the landscape, I think Zinn would have been, sort of supplementary reading. Hey, if you want to see what a bright red Marxist has to say about American history, read this. And if it were that would be different. I would almost welcome his presence. But as a form of diversity. But we don't have that. We have him being overly dominant. Or there's this book, Lies My Teacher Taught Me, and that these are both. Doesn't that title alone tell you something about the disposition of history education? And the fact is that the teachers aren't really teaching those lies. They haven't for a long time. Well, I work with teachers, and I know what the difficulties they face
Yeah.
So,
well, Bill,
that's another reason. To go back to your opening question, that's another reason I wrote the book. I know enough teachers who wanted something like this, and I wrote it with them in mind, in part.
Well,
I did think of it as a non-textbook.
We hope that your non-textbook textbook, Land of Hope by Bill McClay, sells millions of copies and pushes Howard Zinn off of high school and college reading lists for some time to come.
Well,
I wish you every success with this book, Bill.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.